Hello! Today we're walking through 10 practice problems concerning the process of cellular respiration. So if any of these terms here look familiar, you're in the right place. And by the way, if you find this video to be helpful, please subscribe to my channel. The more subscribers the channel has, the more likely YouTube will suggest my video to someone else who may be looking for help on cellular respiration. Now here's the first question, and as we go along with the questions, be prepared to pause the video after the question so you can think about the answer. Then come back and we'll talk about the answer and walk through why that's the case. So here's question 1. How many molecules of ATP are generated by the complete oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide and water in cellular respiration? Is it 1, 3, 6, 12, or 32? Pause the video. Think about the answer, and then come back. Okay, so with question 1, how many molecules of ATP are generated by the oxidation of glucose in cellular respiration? The answer is 32. And this is just an average, remember. So your professor or the book you're reading might say 28 to 34, and that's okay. Just remember, it's going to be about 32 molecules of ATP, and if you're being tested on this, well then, of course, instead of remembering 32, you need to remember whatever your professor or the book you're using is using as its number of ATP. And that depends on things like the type of cell or the availability of the molecules needed and such, but generally 32 is commonly used as the average of how many ATP are generated. So if you're trying to remember this, well, it's helpful to remember this very important chemical equation in cellular respiration. So 1 glucose molecule and 6 molecules of molecular oxygen enter the process of cellular respiration, which produces 32 molecules of ATP, along with 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. So I don't know if you've noticed, but the key here is 6. And that's because glucose has 6 carbons in it, okay? So we use 1 glucose molecule, but that 1 glucose molecule has 6 carbons. So the carbons in the glucose are going to become the carbons in carbon dioxide, and oxygen, the 6 molecules of oxygen, are going to be reduced to 6 molecules of water, which is kind of cool if you think about it, because we think that we inhale oxygen and as through cellular respiration it becomes carbon dioxide, but that's not the case. It's actually the food that we eat. The carbons in the food that we eat become part of the carbon in the carbon dioxide that we exhale. So that's pretty neat. And remember, it's 32 molecules of ATP that are generated. Here's question 2. Which of the following sequences represents the correct order in which metabolic reactions occur during the complete oxidation of glucose through aerobic respiration, aka cellular respiration? Okay, so pause the video here because I'm not going to read all the responses. So pause the video, take a minute to read all the responses, think about what you think the answer is, and then return. Okay, so question 2 asked, which of the following sequences is the correct order in which metabolic reactions occur during the oxidation of glucose through aerobic respiration? Remember, the oxidation of glucose, that means that glucose essentially is going to be broken down and those electrons are going to be used at the very final stage of cellular respiration. So what is the correct order? The answer is C. Glucose is used in the process of glycolysis, which generates pyruvate. That goes through pyruvate oxidation, which generates acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle. Now, all of the electrons that were gathered by NAD+ to become NADH during those stages, those electrons are transferred into the electron transport chain, which is the final stage of cellular respiration where the majority of ATP is generated. Now, if you need a primer or refresher on this, well, here it is. Remember, we start with glucose in cellular respiration. And by the way, the other molecules that we eat, like fats and proteins, they can go into cellular respiration as well. But they go in at different parts of this process that we're discussing of the reactions of cellular respiration. And that's why generally we teach cellular respiration starting with glucose, because it starts at the very beginning and goes to the very end. So you learn the whole thing. But remember that other molecules you eat, like proteins and fats, can also be used in cellular respiration, and they enter at different stages than glucose does. So here in cellular respiration, glucose goes through the process known as glycolysis, right? That's a series of 10 reactions where that glucose molecule is modified and changed and then broken in two so that we end up having two molecules of pyruvate. Now, pyruvate, you can see there's two molecules here, and they each have 3 carbons. So again, follow the carbons. The carbons will help you. Those 2 molecules of pyruvate enter what we call pyruvate oxidation. So again, oxidation is when pyruvate is going to lose electrons, and in this case, it loses carbons too. So pyruvate oxidation, 2 molecules of pyruvate enter this reaction, and the products of the reaction are 2 molecules of what we call acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is going to, these 2 molecules are going to enter the citric acid cycle. So for each molecule that enters the citric acid cycle, the cycle is going to turn once, okay? So first, the first molecule of acetyl-CoA enters, and then the second molecule enters. Now those all end up generating electrons that are going to be used in the electron transport chain. The electrons that are stripped from these molecules during these reactions are generated, and then they are picked up by molecules known as NAD+ or FADH. So during glycolysis, those electrons are gathered by 2 NADH. Pyruvate oxidation generates 2 molecules of NADH. And then the citric acid cycle generates 6 molecules of NADH. And this is the only time that we see FADH2, which is kind of like a cousin to NADH. We get 2 FADH2s. But the deal is these are electron carrier molecules, which means that as throughout the reactions of cellular respiration, as electrons are lost from the molecules in the reactions, those electrons are picked up by these electron carrier molecules. And all of those electron carrier molecules, what do? Well, they carry the electrons to this final stage, the electron transport chain. And that's where finally NADH and FADH2, they become oxidized and lose their electrons, okay? So they give up their electrons to the electron transport chain. In fact, think of that word, electron transport chain. That's where the electrons come from. They come from the ones that have been carried by NADH and FADH2. Okay, so these are the stages, and this is the order of the metabolic reactions in cellular respiration. So again, the correct order is glucose is used in glycolysis. Glycolysis generates pyruvate that is then used in pyruvate oxidation. Pyruvate oxidation results in acetyl-CoA that's used in the citric acid cycle. And then the final stage of the whole thing is the electron transport chain, because those electron carrier molecules have picked up the electrons. They've become reduced, remember, so that they gather the electrons from the molecules throughout these reactions, and they transfer them to the final stage of the electron transport chain. That's where the electrons come from. Question 3. How many molecules of NADH are generated by the complete oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide and water in cellular respiration? Okay, so were you paying attention? Pause the video, maybe rewind it a little bit if you want to review, and then come back and we'll talk. Okay, the answer is 10. There are 10 total molecules of NADH that are generated in the entire process of cellular respiration. And here they are. Remember, in glycolysis, 2 NADH are generated. In pyruvate oxidation, 2 NADH are generated. And then during the citric acid cycle, 6 NADH are generated. And all of those NADH, their point as electron carrier molecules is to carry those electrons to the final step. And finally, they become oxidized so that those electrons, they lose them, and the electrons become part of the electron transport chain. Okay, so there are 10 NADH in total that are generated in the reactions of cellular respiration. Okay, here's question 4, which also has to do with NAD+ and NADH. So when a molecule of NAD+ gains electrons from hydrogen atoms, the NAD+ molecule becomes Is it A, redoxed, B, oxidized, C, reduced, D, dehydrogenated, or E, hydrolyzed? Pause the video to think about your answer and then come back. Okay, so the question is, when a molecule of NAD plus gains electrons from hydrogen atoms, what happens? The NAD plus molecule becomes, and the answer is reduced. Okay, so the question is saying that NAD plus is gaining electrons. And remember, the gain of electrons, we call that reduction. So I like to remember the mnemonic oil rig, right, where each letter stands for oxidation is loss of electrons. Reduction is gain of electrons. And this helps me remember the terms oxidation and reduction. So reduction is gain of electrons, and this question told us that NAD plus gains electrons. Okay, so NAD plus becomes reduced. Now I know this kind of sounds like it doesn't make sense, right? Because if NAD plus gains electrons, how can it become reduced? Reduced means exactly the opposite thing. Well, remember that electrons are negatively charged, okay? So if NAD plus gains negative charges, its total charge becomes reduced because those electrons are negatively charged. Okay, so think about it like if you're taking a class and you have your final grade, your total grade, right? Well, if you gain bad grades, right? If you have bad grades added onto your total grade, yeah, you're getting more grades, but those grades are not good, so they're going to reduce your total score. And it's the same thing here with NAD+. When NAD+ gains electrons, we call it reduction because those electrons are negative. They're negatively charged, so the total charge on the molecule goes down. Now, if you need a little review on NAD+ and NADH, remember that this molecule, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, comes from niacin, one of the B vitamins, and it is an electron carrier molecule. So as glucose and other molecules in the process of cellular respiration, as they lose their electrons, NAD+, as an electron carrier molecule, is going to pick up those electrons. And when those electrons join to NAD+, right, that means it is reduced to NADH. We're going to keep that mnemonic in mind again. Oxidation is loss of electrons. Reduction is gain of electrons. So NAD+ becomes reduced to NADH. Now, at the final stage of cellular respiration, NADH loses those electrons. It gives them up to the electron transport chain. So NADH now becomes oxidized back to NAD+. Okay, so NAD+ is the oxidized form. It doesn't have the electrons. NADH is the reduced form because it's picked up those extra electrons. And NADH can then lose the electrons. It can become oxidized back to NAD+. Okay, so NAD is this electron carrier molecule that has the ability to pick up extra electrons and then also lose those extra electrons. It's an electron carrier molecule. And just remember, oxidation, that term, oxidation means loss of electrons, and reduction means gain of electrons. Question 5. In which stage or stages of cellular respiration is FADH2 generated? Pause the video, maybe rewind it if you need a little refresher because we did discuss this briefly, and then come back and we'll talk about it together. Okay, question 5 asks, in which stage or stages of cellular respiration is FADH2 generated? And the answer is the citric acid cycle. If you think back to all of the stages of cellular respiration, we have glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And the only time you will see FADH2 involved is the citric acid cycle. Okay, that's where FADH2 is generated. It's like NADH or NAD+, it is an electron carrier molecule. So FAD picks up electrons from 2 hydrogen atoms and becomes FADH2. And as an electron carrier molecule, that FADH2 is going to transfer those electrons to the electron transport chain. Okay, so the question asked in which stage of cellular respiration is FADH2 generated? And it is generated from FAD at the citric acid cycle. Question 6. In which stage or stages of cellular respiration is ATP generated? Select all that apply. Is it glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, and or the electron transport chain? Pause the video and then we'll come back to discuss. Okay, in which stage or stages of cellular respiration is ATP generated? And the answer here is more than one, okay? Glycolysis generates ATP, the citric acid cycle, and also the electron transport chain. They all generate ATP in the process of these various stages. So here I've rearranged our study slide a little bit so that we have the different stages on the left, glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And then I've put in how many electron carriers are generated, right, in the process. So we have 2 NADH from glycolysis, 2 from pyruvate oxidation, and 6 from the citric acid cycle. And we know that the citric acid cycle also generates FADH2, 2 molecules that are carrying electrons. Now, as far as ATP generated, glycolysis generates 4 molecules of ATP. The citric acid cycle generates 2 molecules of ATP, and the electron transport chain, that's the final stage, generates the most. It is the most productive of all the various stages. That's its point, after all, is to generate ATP. So 28 molecules of ATP are generated during the electron transport chain. Now, just as a side note, because you might hear these words, substrate-level phosphorylation and oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, these are the 2 types of ATP generation that we see during cellular respiration. Phosphorylation, and maybe you want to say that word out loud, phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is simply adding a phosphate group to a molecule. And ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So to get to 3 phosphates, to be a triphosphate, well, we start with adenosine diphosphate, ADP, and we add a phosphate group to it. So it becomes ATP. Okay, so ADP is phosphorylated to ATP. So during glycolysis in the citric acid cycle, this happens through substrate-level phosphorylation. And all that means is that the phosphate group was transferred from one of the reactants of cellular respiration, one of the molecules in cellular respiration. It was transferred from one of the molecules to ADP so that ADP becomes ATP. Okay, substrate-level phosphorylation really just means that phosphate group is coming from another molecule in one of these reactions of cellular respiration. Now, during the electron transport chain, where we get 28 ATP, we call that oxidative phosphorylation, because oxidative phosphorylation is not going to transfer that phosphate group from another molecule. It's actually going to be a free inorganic phosphate group. Okay, so it's like ADP is going to be joined together with a free phosphate group to become ATP. Okay, so if that phosphate group that's being joined to ADP, if it comes from another molecule and it was part of another molecule during the reactions of cellular respiration, we call it substrate-level phosphorylation. But if that phosphate group is free and on its own when it joins to ADP, we call it oxidative phosphorylation. But the total we see is that there are 34 ATP here generated during the process of cellular respiration. 4 in glycolysis, 2 in the citric acid cycle, and 28 during the electron transport chain. So here's the next question, and it's related. In which stage or stages of cellular respiration is ATP used? Okay, so the previous question asked about where ATP is generated, but this one is asking in which stages of cellular respiration is ATP used? Select all that apply. Is it glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and the electron transfer cycle? Pause the video and then we'll talk. Okay, in which stages of cellular respiration is ATP used? And the answer is glycolysis. So we know that ATP is generated during glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain, but ATP is only used in the stages of glycolysis. Here's our handy chart again. This reminds us where ATP is generated. Now we're going to add in that ATP is used in glycolysis, and glycolysis uses 2 molecules of ATP. Now remember, ATP is the energy in the cell. It sort of energizes the reaction so that the reactants have enough free energy to react with each other and start the process. So this actually makes sense, right? Because if you're starting off the series of reactions, you have to overcome the activation energy, right? You have to put in a little bit of energy into the system so that the reactions can start, and then they will proceed spontaneously. So to start the whole process off, well, at the beginning is where you're going to need that energy. And so the very first reactions of the glycolysis, that's where the ATP is going to be used. So think about this. During glycolysis, it uses 2 ATP, but then later generates 4 ATP. So altogether, glycolysis gives us a net ATP of 2, right? The net is essentially how many do we have at the end of the process. We generated 4, but we used 2, so we had a net of 2. So altogether in cellular respiration, there are actually 34 ATP total that are generated, but remember that 2 are used at the very first reactions of glycolysis. So altogether, that 1 glucose molecule results in a net of 32 ATP for the whole process. So when we look back at the stages of cellular respiration where ATP is generated, right, this was question 6, we know that glycolysis gives us a net of 2, the citric acid cycle gives us a net of 2, and the electron transport chain gives us a net of 28. So altogether, that 1 glucose molecule results in 32 molecules of ATP. Question 9. In which stage or stages of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide generated? Select all that apply. Is it glycolysis, or pyruvate oxidation, or citric acid cycle, or electron transfer cycle? So pause the video and then we'll talk about this. So question 9 asks, in which stage or stages of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide generated? And the answer is B and C, pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. So let's add that into our chart, okay? So we have our electron carriers, the number of ATP that were used or generated, and now the carbon dioxide. So in pyruvate oxidation, 2 carbon dioxide are generated. In the citric acid cycle, 4 carbon dioxide are generated. And the key here is to watch the carbons, because glucose starts out with 6 carbons. And whenever the molecule that glucose is being rearranged, right, glucose ends up being rearranged and transformed in all of these reactions of cellular respiration so that electrons can be stripped from it. And anytime one of the carbons starts with 6 carbons, so anytime it loses one of those carbons, it's lost as carbon dioxide. So we know that 2 of the carbons of glucose are lost during pyruvate oxidation, and they're lost as carbon dioxide, okay? 4 carbon dioxides are generated in the process of the citric acid cycle, and so that means that the remaining 4 carbons of glucose, they end up being released as carbon dioxide. If you want to look at it this way, remember this in the box, in the blue box, this is glycolysis, where glucose is going to undergo a series of 10 reactions, and the final product of glycolysis is 2 pyruvate molecules. Now count the carbons. Glucose starts with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the product of glycolysis, which is 2 pyruvate molecules, well, each pyruvate has 3 carbons. So 3 plus 3 is 6. We haven't lost any carbons yet. None of the carbons have been released. That means no carbon dioxide is released in glycolysis. Now the second stage is pyruvate oxidation. So in pyruvate oxidation, 2 pyruvate molecules are modified to become 2 acetyl-CoA molecules. Now, CoA is a coenzyme. It's going to pick up the product of pyruvate oxidation, which is this acetyl group here. So if we count the carbons here, 2 pyruvate molecules have 6 total carbons. The 2 acetyl-CoA molecules have 4 carbons. Okay, so the CoA doesn't have the carbons that we're looking here from glucose. That simply shuttles the acetyl group from one part of cellular respiration to the next part. So the pyruvate molecules have 6 carbons. The acetyl groups that are picked up by CoA have 4 carbons, and so we know that those 2 missing carbons, quote unquote, those are released as carbon dioxide. Now the next stage is those acetyl-CoA molecules are going to enter the citric acid cycle. Acetyl-CoA, the CoA part, shuttles the acetyl group into the citric acid cycle. So the acetyl groups are what enter the citric acid cycle. They join into the citric acid cycle with a molecule that's already in the cycle called oxaloacetate. Now we see that this is a cycle, right? So the acetyl groups enter into the cycle, but there's no molecule that is a result of this. It's a cycle. So the acetyl groups join with oxaloacetate, and as that molecule continues to be modified and rearranged throughout the cycle, it gets back to becoming oxaloacetate, okay? And then the cycle continues. Now oxaloacetate can bind to another molecule of acetyl-CoA, and the cycle can turn again. But you notice none of that glucose molecule ends up being a product of the citric acid cycle. The entire thing ends up being consumed in the citric acid cycle. So the 4 carbons that are left from those 2 acetyl groups end up being consumed completely, and those 4 carbons are released as part of carbon dioxide. So altogether, we see that 2 molecules of carbon dioxide are released during the process of pyruvate oxidation, and the remaining 4 molecules of carbon dioxide are released in the citric acid cycle. And those carbons from carbon dioxide come from the carbons that were part of that glucose molecule. So I just think this is the coolest thing, that you eat glucose, you eat sugar, and those carbons in the sugar become part of the carbon in the carbon dioxide that you exhale. So you're actually exhaling part of the food that you ate. I think that's really neat. So the answer here, carbon dioxide is generated during pyruvate oxidation and during the citric acid cycle. Now here's question 10, the final question, and it's a big question, so you're going to need to pause here and read through the entire stages and enter answers into the blanks that are found. Okay, so fill in the blanks in this paragraph about glycolysis. Pause the video, take your time, and then we'll go through it together. Here are the answers to question 10. The molecule that enters the reactions of glycolysis is glucose. Now, during glycolysis, 2 ATP are used in the beginning reactions. However, 4 ATP are generated during glycolysis for a net value of 2 ATP. 2 NADH are generated from 2 NAD+, and that's a 0, no carbon dioxide are generated during glycolysis. The 3-carbon molecule that results from the 10 reactions of glycolysis is called pyruvate, and 2 pyruvate molecules are produced from 1 glucose molecule. How do you think you did? This question asked you to fill in the blanks for what happens during glycolysis, but a great way to study would be to create a question like this for pyruvate oxidation in the citric acid cycle as well, talking about what the products and reactants are of the various stages. Now let's review the process of glycolysis to see where these molecules and numbers came from. So here's glycolysis, which I also like to call glucose oxidation because that's what's happening. Glucose is being oxidized. Remember, oxidation is loss of electrons, so these 10 reactions modify glucose, and as glucose becomes rearranged and modified into slightly different molecules, electrons are stripped from it. So glucose is oxidized during the process of glycolysis. Here's our 6-carbon glucose molecule at the top. And in the first reactions of glycolysis, 2 ATP molecules are broken down to release those phosphate groups from ATP. Those phosphate groups become joined to the glucose molecule as it's being modified and provides the energy to start these reactions, okay, of glycolysis. Now, in the latter stages of glycolysis, as that glucose molecule goes through these reactions and is being modified and changed, electrons are stripped from the molecule, and those electrons are picked up by 2 NAD plus molecules. Those NAD plus, having been reduced, become NADH, right? Gain of electrons is reduction. When they gain the electrons, they become NADH. And in the final reactions of glycolysis, 4 ATP are also generated. Now, the product of glycolysis is 2 molecules of pyruvate. Each pyruvate molecule has 1, 2, 3 carbons, okay? So glucose has 6 carbons, and the 2 pyruvate molecules together also have 6 carbons, so no carbon dioxide has been released in the process of glycolysis. Okay, so glucose is oxidized in the process of glycolysis into 2 pyruvate molecules. 2 ATP molecules are used to start the process, but then 4 ATP molecules are generated, and that means we have a net of 2 ATP molecules from glycolysis. In addition, 2 NAD plus molecules become reduced to 2 molecules of NADH. Now, there are a lot of numbers and details in the process of cellular respiration, so if you're wondering how to study, one of the best ways is to create a study chart. And I've made this chart here for you. So you can pause the video, recreate this chart, or take a screenshot of it, and then fill in the answers to each question that's shown here, okay, in each column. So through glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, and the citric acid cycle, what's the starting molecule, also known as the substrate? What's the ending molecule in those stages? That would be the product of glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, or the citric acid cycle. How many ATP are used? How many ATP are generated in these stages? How many NADH are generated, and how many FADH2 are generated? And finally, how many carbon dioxide are generated? Now, if you want to take it one step further, put down another column that asks, where in a eukaryotic cell does each stage occur? Now, once you have the chart, the next task, of course, is to memorize everything that you've put into this chart. But this chart can help you come up with practice questions that will help you remember these. So you can make flashcards that say, okay, how many ATP are generated in the process of pyruvate oxidation, right? You can refer back to your chart for the answer. No, I'm not going to leave you hanging here. So I've filled in the chart for you so that you can take a screenshot of this and use it to help you study and do well in cellular respiration. That's all for today. I hope this review has been helpful to you. And if it has, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel so that YouTube will suggest this video to other people who are looking for some help with cellular respiration too.